It was a crisp autumn morning, and Barron Trump was seated in his classroom at a prestigious private school. The chatter of his classmates filled the air as their teacher, Mr. Reynolds, prepared to start the lesson. Barron had always been a quiet, reserved student who preferred to blend into the background rather than attract attention. But today, the air felt different, tense. As the lesson began, Mr. Reynolds paced the front of the room, discussing political satire and modern media. His voice carried a sharp edge, but nobody expected what would come next. You know, he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, some people are born into privilege without ever lifting a finger. Imagine being the son of someone so polarizing that half the country despises your family name. The room went silent. Everyone knew he was talking about Barron. Heads turned slightly, but nobody dared make eye contact with him. Barron froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He clenched his fists under the desk, trying to process what had just happened. Mr. Reynolds chuckled, continuing his lesson as if nothing had occurred, but the damage was done. For Barron, it was more than a passing remark. It was personal. The mocking tone, the blatant disrespect for his family, and the audible snickers from a few classmates left him feeling humiliated. Yet he sat there, calm on the surface, while a storm brewed inside him. The bell rang, releasing the class, but Barron stayed seated, staring at his notebook. His best friend Jake approached him hesitantly. "Hey, Barron, are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice filled with concern. Barron nodded but remained silent. As he walked home that day, Barron replayed the moment in his head. He knew he couldn't let it go. For years, he had endured whispers, judgmental stares, and biased opinions about his family. But this was different. This was in his classroom, a place where he should feel safe. The quiet, introspective boy had decided he wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Barron spent the evening in his room, staring at the ceiling. The humiliation lingered, but so did the determination to respond in a way that would make an impact. His mother, Melania, knocked gently on his door and entered. She immediately noticed something was off. "Barron, what's wrong?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. After a moment of hesitation, Barron recounted the incident with Mr. Reynolds. Melania listened intently, her face a mixture of anger and concern. "You don't have to deal with this alone," she said softly, but Barron shook his head. "I need to handle this, Mom. It's important." The next day, Barron approached Jake during lunch. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady. Jake raised an eyebrow but nodded. "What's the plan?" Barron laid out his idea. They would confront Mr. Reynolds, not with anger, but with grace and intellect. Barron wanted to challenge him publicly during class, using the very topics the teacher loved, literature and satire, to make his point. Jake was skeptical but agreed to support his friend. Over the next few days, Barron prepared meticulously. He read books on satire, researched political discourse, and even practiced speaking in front of a mirror. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to make a statement that nobody in that school would forget. The following Monday, Barron walked into the classroom with an air of quiet confidence. Mr. Reynolds began his lesson, oblivious to the storm brewing. As the discussion shifted to societal privilege and power dynamics, Barron raised his hand. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, his voice steady, "you often talk about the importance of fairness and understanding in society. But last week, you made a comment that seemed to contradict those values." The room went silent. Mr. Reynolds looked taken aback but quickly regained his composure. "And what comment would that be, Barron?" he asked, his tone dismissive. Barron took a deep breath. "You implied that my achievements, or lack thereof, are solely because of my family name. But isn't it unfair to judge someone based on their background rather than their actions?" The class was riveted. Mr. Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued. "You taught us that satire should punch up, challenging those in power. But your comment wasn't satire. It was a personal attack. And it didn't challenge power. It targeted a student who's here to learn, just like everyone else." The room erupted in applause. Even students who had laughed at Barron last week were now nodding in agreement. Mr. Reynolds stood speechless, his face flushed. The day after the confrontation, Barron walked into school and immediately felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Whispers filled the hallways and students glanced at him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. It was as though he had shed an invisible cloak of anonymity overnight. By lunchtime, the incident had become the talk of the school. Everyone was discussing how Barron Trump, often seen as quiet and reserved, had stood up to one of the most intimidating teachers in the school. Jake, his best friend, grinned as they sat at their usual table. "Dude, you're a legend now. That was incredible," Jake said, clapping him on the back. Barron offered a small smile, but inside he felt a mix of pride and apprehension. What Barron didn't realize was that his moment of courage had traveled far beyond the school. Unbeknownst to him, two classmates sitting at the back of the room had filmed the entire confrontation and posted it online. The video, captioned "Barron Trump confronts biased teacher," quickly gained traction. By the end of the day, it had been shared thousands of times on social media platforms. Comments flooded in, ranging from admiration for Barron's eloquence to heated debates about privilege and respect. At home, Melania was the first to discover the viral video. She was scrolling through her phone when she stumbled across it, her eyes widening in surprise. She immediately called Barron into the living room. "Barron, come here, look at this," she said, handing him her phone. Barron watched the video in stunned silence. The camera captured every word he had said, and the online reactions poured in beneath it. "This kid has more composure than most adults," one comment read. Another said, "Barron Trump is wise beyond his years." What a class act. By dinner, the entire family was buzzing with the news. Donald Trump called from his office. "Barron, you made quite the splash. I always knew you had the Trump spirit," he said, his voice full of pride. Barron chuckled softly but felt a deep sense of accomplishment. But not all reactions were positive. Some critics twisted the story to fit their own narratives, using the video as ammunition in political debates. Barron knew this was inevitable, but he refused to let it overshadow what he had achieved. His actions had sparked a conversation, and that was what mattered most. The day after the video went viral, Mr. Reynolds requested a private meeting with Barron after class. Barron hesitated but agreed, curious about what his teacher had to say. As the last student left the room, Mr. Reynolds closed the door and turned to face Barron. "Barron," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I owe you an apology. I've been reflecting on what happened, and I realize I crossed a line, a big one. My comment was unprofessional and unfair. I let my personal frustrations cloud my judgment, and for that I am truly sorry." Barron studied the man's face, searching for sincerity. He saw regret etched in the lines of his teacher's expression. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," Barron replied after a pause. "I appreciate your apology. I hope this can be a learning moment for all of us." The teacher nodded, visibly relieved by Barron's maturity. "It's already a learning moment for me. I also want to address the class and make things right publicly." True to his word, Mr. Reynolds began the next lesson by standing before his students, his tone uncharacteristically humble. "Before we start today's lesson, I need to own up to my mistake," he said. "Last week, I said something about Barron that was inappropriate and unfair. I let my personal opinions interfere with my role as an educator, and that's unacceptable. I've apologized to Barron privately, but I want to do so here as well." The classroom was silent, the usual air of tension replaced with respect. Barron nodded, acknowledging the gesture. For many students, this moment marked a turning point. They saw their teacher in a new light, not as infallible, but as someone willing to admit his faults and grow from them. Later that day, Mr. Reynolds approached the principal, proposing a new initiative. He suggested creating a series of workshops focused on fostering respectful discussions and challenging bias in constructive ways. The administration embraced the idea, and Barron was invited to help shape the program. Weeks passed, and life at school gradually returned to normal, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, Barron's confrontation with Mr. Reynolds had left a lasting mark. The video continued to circulate online, garnering millions of views. People from all walks of life praised Barron's courage and eloquence, calling him a role model for young people. At school, the workshops that Barron helped design were in full swing. He and Mr. Reynolds worked together to create sessions where students could openly discuss topics like privilege, bias, and empathy. These workshops quickly became a cornerstone of the school's culture, and students found themselves engaging in deeper, more meaningful conversations. For Barron, the experience was transformative. He realized that his voice carried weight, not just because of his last name, but because of his actions. He began participating in more school activities, joining the debate team and mentoring younger students. His peers, once hesitant to approach him, now saw him as approachable and inspiring. At home, Barron's family continued to support him. Melania often reminded him to stay grounded, while Donald reveled in the pride of his son's newfound reputation. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, kid," Donald told him one evening. Barron smiled, but he knew his journey was just beginning. The video's impact extended far beyond the school. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a testament to the power of standing up for oneself with dignity and grace. Barron received letters from strangers, students, teachers, and even parents, thanking him for his courage. Some shared their own stories of overcoming prejudice and bias, inspired by his example. As Barron walked through the school hallways one afternoon, he overheard a group of younger students discussing the workshops. "It's cool that we can actually talk about this stuff now," one said. Another added, "Barron Trump is kind of a legend." Barron smiled to himself, but not out of vanity. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for growth, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And as he headed to his next class, he knew one thing for certain. He had found his voice, and he wasn't afraid to use it.